At 3:45 a.m., the calm over the Baltic was shattered. 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets crossed straight into Estonian airspace, flying fast and low with their transponders switched off. No warning, no signal, no clearance. They cut across the NATO border like ghosts, their radar signatures blinking on NATO screens in seconds. Controllers in Tallinn shouted out bearings. The message was clear: violation, not mistake. Within minutes, Italian F-35s scrambled from their forward base, engines roaring into the cold night sky. NATO had been waiting for something like this. The Russians had poked the line, and the response was immediate. This wasn't random. Just hours earlier, NATO had already gone on edge after multiple drone intrusions over Poland and Romania. Russian operators had been testing defenses, pushing smaller unmanned craft close to NATO facilities, then pulling them back before engagement. It was harassment, a pattern of provocation. The MiG-31s were the next move. They were not ordinary patrols. These jets were interceptors, fast, armed, and known for long-range missiles that could threaten both NATO jets and ground installations. Their sudden push across Estonia's border was no accident. It was a deliberate test. Inside NATO's air command, radar screens lit up red. The MiGs were tracking straight towards sensitive Estonian airspace, not drifting along the border, but cutting through it. Controllers didn't hesitate. Calls went out, vectors were plotted, and within seconds, Italian F-35s and a backup pair from an Estonian airstrip were airborne. These weren't training maneuvers or mock drills. This was live intercept, and every pilot in the air knew the stakes. For NATO, speed mattered more than anything. A delayed response would send the wrong message, that Russian fighters could cross borders at will. That wasn't going to happen. The F-35s powered up, stealth profiles dropping as they roared into supersonic climb. Afterburners lit, flames pouring from their engines as they raced to cut off the intruders. In the Baltic skies, the hunt was on. On the Russian side, the move was bold but dangerous. The MiG-31s had crossed without clearance, knowing full well NATO radar would catch them instantly. Their goal wasn't to strike, not yet, but to measure how fast the alliance would react. Would NATO hesitate? Would it try to radio warnings first, or would it show strength at once? The Russians wanted to see. What they got was a response faster and sharper than they expected. By the time the MiGs were 20 miles inside Estonian skies, the F-35s were already closing in. Controllers guided them with pinpoint precision, boxing the Russian jets into tight vectors. This wasn't going to be a long dance. NATO wasn't here to negotiate. It was here to dominate. The opening move was over. What came next would decide if this violation ended in retreat or fire. The intercept was unfolding fast. NATO radar operators tracked every move as the F-35s closed the gap. The Russian MiG-31s flew in tight formation, their speed pushing past Mach 2, slicing across the Baltic night. On NATO screens, the vectors looked like arrows, straight, aggressive, and aimed at sensitive airspace near Tallinn. Controllers gave the order: intercept, not negotiate. No one expected this to end with calm radio chatter. The Russians had come in silent, and silence at that speed was no mistake. Inside the cockpits of the F-35s, the pilots locked weapon systems hot but held fire. Rules of engagement were clear: escort, force compliance, but only shoot if directly threatened. Still, the tone was aggressive. Sensors tracked the MiGs, painting their heat signatures, locking onto their radar emissions. One NATO pilot pulsed a lock-on warning, lighting up a Russian jet's threat display. In the MiG cockpit, alarms screamed: missile lock detected. That was no bluff. The message was clear: one wrong move, and you will not make it back. The MiGs tried evasive maneuvers. Their formation broke slightly, 2 jets banking hard to the left, 1 dropping altitude. They were testing response, forcing the F-35s to spread and chase. But the NATO pilots stayed tight, maintaining speed and altitude advantage. The stealth jets weren't just fast, they were electronically dominant. Electronic warfare systems jammed the MiGs' radar, feeding them false signals, ghost blips, and scrambled bearings. For Russian pilots, the cockpit suddenly became chaos: alarms, static, and confusion. They could see their opponents visually now, glowing afterburners in the night sky, but their instruments betrayed them. Down below, NATO surface posts in Estonia and Latvia tracked everything. SAM batteries were primed, communications were live across multiple bases, and AWACS aircraft orbited high above, feeding targeting data in real time. The Russians were boxed in from every angle: land, air, and sky. Still, they pressed deeper, pushing 10, then 15 miles inside the border. Each second they stayed in NATO skies raised the stakes. Then came the decisive moment. One F-35 pulled sharp across the lead MiG's nose, cutting so close the Russian pilot had to bank violently to avoid collision. It was a textbook show of force, calculated risk, controlled intimidation. In that instant, the Russian formation broke wide open. One MiG rolled sharply right, another climbed hard, and the third dropped speed. They were no longer united, no longer pushing forward. They had been scattered, and in the air, that meant control was lost. But NATO wasn't finished. The F-35s closed tighter, keeping missile locks active, every Russian pilot staring at warning lights flashing red in the cockpit. One by one, the MiGs had a choice: push on and risk annihilation, or peel away. Two chose to peel, banking sharp toward the Russian border. But one lingered, its course uncertain, its pilot refusing to yield. For NATO, that meant the next phase was coming. Seconds would decide whether this became a retreat or a kill. The lone MiG that refused to break away became the center of attention. NATO controllers marked it red on screens, and the F-35s shifted formation to box it in. The Russian jet held altitude, nose angled slightly toward Tallinn, its afterburner glowing as it tried to push deeper into NATO skies. This wasn't a navigational mistake anymore. It was deliberate. The pilot wanted to test resolve, to see if NATO would actually engage. But the F-35s were built for moments like this. Inside the NATO cockpits, targeting systems were armed and ready. One pilot activated the electronic warfare suite, blasting the MiG's radar with false echoes. In the Russian cockpit, the pilot saw multiple ghost targets appear, shifting and multiplying across his display. He pulled sharp right, trying to align with one blip, but the F-35s already had him locked visually. A second NATO jet climbed high, looping over and diving down, placing itself directly behind the MiG's tail. From that angle, a missile shot would be impossible to dodge. The Russian pilot knew it. His alarm screamed, his panels flashed red, his margin for survival shrinking to zero. Still, he pressed forward. He dropped altitude, racing just above the tree line, hoping speed and terrain would shake the interceptors. But the F-35's infrared sensors tracked his heat signature with ease. From above, another NATO jet released flares, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Fireballs cutting the sky, a bright reminder that the next signal could be real missiles. The Russian jet jerked, banking sharp, but the NATO formation held him tight, cutting every escape angle. On the ground, Estonian and Latvian radar stations recorded every second. Command posts relayed the standoff across NATO channels. In Brussels, NATO representatives were already preparing formal responses, but in the air, the decision belonged to the pilots. One F-35 shifted closer, so near that the Russian pilot could see the helmet visor of his opponent through the canopy glass. That was no negotiation. That was domination. Then came the breaking point. The MiG's radar emitted a quick pulse, stronger than before, scanning directly across the lead F-35. For a split second, it looked like a fire control lock attempt, the final step before launching a missile. That crossed the line. Instantly, two F-35s lit up their targeting pods and simulated lock-on with AIM-120 missiles. The Russian pilot's alarm screamed continuous missile tone. To him, it meant death was seconds away. The Russian jet jolted, its nose lifted, its afterburner roared, and it banked sharply toward home. No shots had been fired, but the message was unmistakable. In air combat, hesitation kills. And at that moment, hesitation belonged entirely to Moscow. The MiG had been forced to yield, its aggressive push collapsing under NATO's superior speed, stealth, and electronic control. The skies above Estonia were NATO's once again. By the time the Russian jets retreated across the border, NATO's dominance was clear. The F-35s circled high above the Baltic, holding position like silent guardians, ensuring no second wave would follow. Controllers in Estonia declared the airspace secure, and for the first time in nearly 20 minutes, the tension broke. But the message of what just happened spread far beyond the skies. Within NATO headquarters, the incident was logged not just as an airspace violation, but as a deliberate probe, a test of willpower. Moscow wanted to see hesitation, wanted to see cracks in the alliance. Instead, they saw instant coordination, flawless execution, and overwhelming superiority. On Russian state media, the story was spun differently. Officials claimed it was a navigation error, that the MiGs had simply veered off course during training. But no one believed it. Satellites had tracked the flight path. NATO had every second of radar proof, and pilots had visual confirmation. This was no accident. It was a calculated risk, meant to remind NATO that Russia was still bold enough to cross the line. But instead of intimidation, the result was humiliation. The MiGs had been jammed, boxed in, and forced to retreat without a single shot fired. For Moscow's Air Force, it was a silent defeat. Diplomatic fallout was immediate. Estonia invoked Article 4 consultations, demanding full discussion of the violation. NATO allies voiced support, while Washington and London issued firm condemnations. Brussels pushed the message even further. Any breach of NATO airspace, intentional or not, would meet the same ruthless response. Behind closed doors, intelligence analysts dissected the incident. Why 3 MiGs? Why at night? Why target Estonia instead of Poland or Romania? The conclusion was unsettling. Russia wasn't only testing borders, it was testing NATO's nerve. And NATO had just given them the answer. The strategic lesson echoed across every capital. In modern air power, hesitation kills. NATO's pilots showed that readiness wasn't theory, it was practice. From scramble to intercept, the timeline was less than 4 minutes. Russian jets entered NATO skies, and NATO erased the threat before Moscow could even issue a denial. For ordinary citizens across the Baltics, it meant safety. For Moscow, it meant embarrassment. And for the world, it was proof that the balance of air dominance in Europe still leaned entirely toward NATO. In the end, the standoff was more than just a border clash. It was a signal, a warning, and a reminder that one wrong move in the Baltic skies could ignite something far bigger. Russia had crossed the line to provoke, to test, to scare. NATO had answered with speed, precision, and force, without a single missile fired. The skies cleared, but the message stayed heavy. The next time Russia tried to cross that line, the erasure might not be symbolic. It might be real, fast, and final.